What happens when a simple request for help turns into a moment of heartbreak and injustice at 36,000 feet? Imagine holding your 6-month-old infant in your arms, trusting the world around you to care for your child, only to be met with cold indifference and dismissive neglect. Malcolm Reed, a devoted father and pediatric surgeon, experienced this exact nightmare when a flight attendant spilled scalding hot coffee on his sleeping son. But what made this tragedy even more harrowing wasn't just the accident itself, it was the way Malcolm was treated before, during, and after the incident. How far does silent bias reach when the stakes are life and dignity? Who watches when injustice hides behind the routine? And what happens when the right witness steps forward at the exact right moment? This is not just a story about a spilled cup or a burned infant. It's a story about courage, resilience, and the quiet strength of a man who refused to be silenced. It's about how one act witnessed by a Supreme Court justice and countless others sparked a fight for accountability and change in a system long broken. If you believe in standing up for what's right, hit like, share this story, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin this journey together. The airport was already humming by 5:42 a.m. Announcements echoed overhead in a rhythm so familiar it almost sounded like background music. TSA lines curled like sleepy snakes across the terminal floor. Neon signs buzzed faintly above the coffee kiosks. Travelers dragged roller bags and children behind them, their faces blurred with exhaustion, anticipation, or both. Malcolm Reed shifted the diaper bag on his shoulder and pulled his coat tighter around his son. 6-month-old Micah stirred gently against his chest, tucked inside a soft carrier. His tiny hands curled into fists beneath his chin. The infant's breath was warm against Malcolm's shirt, rhythmic and even. For now, Malcolm closed his eyes for a brief moment. Just a moment. Then opened them again. The terminal lights felt too bright, the air too dry. But it wasn't the surroundings that made his heart pound. It was the weight of where he was going, and who was no longer here to go with him. Micah let out a small hiccup in his sleep. Malcolm looked down at him and whispered, "It's just you and me now. Little man." He said it the way he'd said it 100 times since the night Selena died. The way he'd said it during those silent midnight feedings, while staring at the ceiling and praying for guidance. The way he'd said it the first time he managed to bathe Micah alone without panicking. And now, again, on the edge of something uncertain. They were headed to Seattle. Selena's parents hadn't yet met Micah. Not in person. Their only daughter gone before they could hold their grandson. That grief had built a chasm between them and Malcolm that none of them knew how to cross. Phone calls were polite but cold. Conversations clipped. Emotions tucked tightly beneath the surface. But this trip was a first step. A gesture of peace, of acknowledgement, maybe of healing. Malcolm adjusted Micah's knit cap, making sure the baby's ears were covered. He'd arrived early, too early. But traveling with an infant meant leaving extra space for blowouts, meltdowns, and the kind of unpredictable chaos that only a 6-month-old could bring. This morning had started at 3:15 a.m. Micah had spit up on his onesie, then cried through most of the Uber ride, but now he slept. Malcolm looked at the departure screen. Flight 418 to Seattle, gate C-37. On time, good. He took a seat at the edge of the waiting area, rocking slightly back and forth, not for himself, but out of habit. The motion soothed Micah, and in a way, it soothed Malcolm too. A woman walked by and smiled at the baby before frowning subtly at Malcolm. That look. He knew it. Alone with a baby. Where's the mother? Do you even know what you're doing? It was always the same questions, sometimes asked with words, sometimes just with glances. Malcolm wasn't new to being doubted. Not in medical school, not in the ER when patients refused to believe he was the attending pediatric surgeon. Not when nurses questioned his orders until a white doctor confirmed them. And not now. He'd learned to keep his face unreadable, calm, impossibly calm. Selena had been different. She would have challenged that woman with a look, maybe even a sharp, polite, surgical sentence. But Selena wasn't here, and calm was all Malcolm had left. He reached into the diaper bag and pulled out a pacifier, wiping it gently before slipping it between Micah's lips. The baby stirred again, but didn't wake. Good. He scanned the crowd. Gate agents were arriving, cleaning crews sweeping under rows of plastic chairs. A child spilled cereal from a baggie and began crying while her father tried to hush her, clearly overwhelmed. Malcolm offered the man a sympathetic glance. The father nodded back. That was something recognition between tired dads. The only nod he'd gotten all morning. He checked his watch. Still over an hour until boarding. His mind drifted. To the first time he and Selena had talked about children. They were on the floor of their tiny apartment in Hyde Park, Chicago, sharing takeout and wondering how they'd balance two high-pressure careers with the messy joy of parenthood. He remembered her laugh, the way she'd rubbed her stomach, months before they ever tried to conceive, and said, "Our kid's going to inherit your worry lines." And now here he was, worried, alone, and determined. Determined that Micah would have everything they'd dreamed of. But also, he was afraid of doing it wrong, afraid of failing, afraid of not being enough. Selena had been fearless, brilliant, sharp as a scalpel and just as precise with her convictions. She would have seen this trip as necessary, even inevitable. Face it now, she would have said, before silence becomes permanent. The overhead speaker crackled. "Attention passengers on Flight 418 to Seattle. Boarding will begin in approximately 1 hour. Please ensure all carry-on bags meet TSA guidelines." Malcolm took a slow breath, adjusted Micah against his chest, checked the zipper on the diaper bag. He knew what came next. TSA, gate agents, boarding zones. He also knew, somewhere in his bones, that this flight wouldn't be simple, not just because of a restless baby, but because of how the world tends to treat men who look like him. And no matter how calm, how qualified, or how careful he was, it was never quite enough. Still, he whispered to Micah again, "We've got this." Because today wasn't just a journey, it was a test, a reckoning, a moment neither of them would forget. The security line was longer than Malcolm expected for a Wednesday morning. It snaked past the queue markers, doubled around twice, and spilled into the center concourse near a pretzel stand that had just started baking for the day. The smell made Micah stir. Malcolm bounced gently on his heels. The baby didn't cry, not yet. But Malcolm could feel the familiar tension rising. It was in the shifting weight of Micah's tiny body, in the small fists twitching beneath the soft blue blanket. A warning. He whispered to his son, "Almost there, buddy. Just a little longer." The woman behind him sighed audibly. She wore a blazer, heels too high for airport floors, and the impatient rhythm of someone unused to waiting. Malcolm glanced back and offered a small smile. She didn't return it. Instead, She muttered something under her breath and looked at her phone. Micah shifted again. Malcolm checked the baby's pacifier, then reached into the side pocket of the diaper bag to find a small rattle, his go-to emergency distraction. It was gone. Maybe it had slipped out in the Uber. He closed his eyes, just for a second. Don't lose focus. The line moved, slowly. When they reached the first TSA checkpoint, a young agent motioned him forward. Malcolm handed over his boarding pass and ID. The agent scanned it quickly and nodded. His tone was automatic. Next. But before Malcolm could move forward, a second agent approached. This one older, mid-50s maybe. Gray streaks in her pulled-back hair and a name badge that read K. Boswell. She looked at Malcolm, then at Micah in the carrier. Her voice was neutral, but her eyes weren't. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am, with my son." Boswell tilted her head slightly. "Can I see his birth certificate?" "Of course." Malcolm reached into the folder in his carry-on. He'd prepared everything in advance, not just because of Micah, but because of experience. Life had taught him to be ready for suspicion. He handed her the certificate. Boswell stared at it for longer than necessary. Her eyes darted between the document and Micah's face, then to Malcolm, then back again. He felt the heat rise in his chest. He'd seen this look before, the one that asked, without asking, "Is this really your child?" He said nothing. Boswell finally nodded. "All right, you can proceed. Place your bags on the belt and remove any electronics or liquids." Malcolm gave a small nod and moved forward. The family ahead of him, white parents with a toddler, had breezed through. No extra questions, no scrutiny, no extended stares, just a smile and a wave. He didn't expect smiles. He just wanted fairness. He laid the diaper bag on the conveyor belt, took off his shoes, and gently unbuckled the carrier strap around his shoulder. He held Micah close, even as the baby began to stir. The metal detector beeped. "Step back. Sir, we'll need to do a pat-down." "Of course you do." Malcolm said nothing out loud. Instead, he passed Micah to a female TSA agent who held him with robotic care while the other officer patted down Malcolm's arms, legs, waistband, and ankles. Routine. They called it routine. Even though the family behind him walked through without delay, Micah began to cry. The sound cut through Malcolm's bones like a tuning fork. He finished the pat down, scooped Micah back into his arms, and rocked him gently. "Almost there, little man. You're okay." The agent handed him the diaper bag, now unzipped, formula containers askew. He took it and stepped away, finding a bench near the end of the line. Micah cried louder. He didn't want to feed him yet. Not here. Not with the smell of sanitizer and the sharp fluorescent lights. Not with his hand still holding the tension of being treated like a suspect. So he bounced and hummed and whispered soft apologies into his son's ear. He remembered something Selena once said after they were stopped walking through a department store. "The thing about racism," she told him, "is that it's so efficient." He didn't understand at first. It doesn't need to scream at you or shove you or burn your house down. All it needs to do is delay you, distract you, make you second guess, one moment at a time. That's all it takes to wear you down. He understood now. Eventually, Micah quieted. Malcolm checked the gate number again. C-37. He gathered his things and began the walk toward the terminal. On the way, he passed a janitor, a man in a blue jumpsuit pushing a mop bucket with one squeaky wheel. The man paused and said, "Beautiful baby." "Thanks. You flying solo?" "Yeah." I got 3 boys myself. Ain't easy. You got this." Malcolm smiled. That was all it took. A small moment of kindness, a nod from someone who knew, who had lived it. He kept walking. The concourse buzzed with early travelers, kids with neck pillows, business people with AirPods, couples holding coffee cups and carry-ons. Somewhere, someone played jazz through a portable speaker tucked into a backpack. Gate C-37 came into view. A digital screen blinked Flight 418 Seattle on time. A gate agent in a navy blazer stood behind the podium, sorting boarding passes. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. Behind her, a flight attendant emerged from the jet bridge and began speaking with her. Malcolm clocked her immediately. She was striking. Blonde ponytail pulled tight, makeup applied with practiced precision, name tag reading Cassandra Mills. She scanned the waiting area like a commander inspecting troops. Malcolm chose a seat near the window and settled in. Micah, finally calm, stared up at him with wide eyes. He bounced him softly, watching the sunrise creep over the tarmac, gold spilling through the windows like spilled syrup. For a brief moment, the world felt quiet again. Then he heard it. A voice, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. "Zone 4 hasn't been called yet, sir." He turned. Cassandra Mills was standing just feet away, arms crossed. "I know," he said, voice even. "I was hoping to request pre-boarding. With the infant." She looked at him, then at Micah, then back. "Pre-boardings for passengers with special needs." He blinked. "I thought parents with infants under 2 qualified. That's at the discretion of the gate staff." She turned away before he could say more. A woman walked up behind him. White, wearing yoga pants and holding a toddler by the hand. Cassandra's face brightened. "You can board now, ma'am. Let me help you with that stroller." Malcolm watched the exchange in silence. The woman didn't even have to ask. He looked down at Micah, still calm, still safe. But for how long? He remembered what Selena used to say. Being dignified in the face of disrespect is not weakness. It's resistance. Quiet, powerful resistance. He held on to that. He would need it. Because something told him this flight wasn't going to be easy. Malcolm stayed seated by the window, bouncing Micah gently on his chest. The baby's eyes fluttered open for a moment, caught the warm glow of morning light, then drifted shut again. His little fingers relaxed against Malcolm's shirt. The moment was fragile. One wrong sound and it would shatter. But then Malcolm's gaze flicked toward the boarding gate again. Cassandra Mills, still standing at the podium. She was speaking quietly to the gate agent, but her posture said everything. Upright, tight, radiating the kind of authority that didn't need to shout. Her smile turned on and off like a switch, depending on who approached. Malcolm watched her greet a man in a business suit with a cheerful nod. She complimented his tie, then turned toward a young black woman holding a baby and barely glanced up as she waved her off with a clipped, "You'll board when your zone is called" pattern. It wasn't loud, it wasn't overt, but it was there, a rhythm, a hierarchy. Malcolm had seen it in hospitals, in meetings, in classrooms, the polite exclusion, the passive control, the burden of having to earn every courtesy others received freely. He adjusted Micah slightly. The baby stirred, but did not cry. Behind him, the waiting area had begun to fill. A group of teens with matching choir shirts huddled around power outlets. A couple in their 60s unwrapped breakfast sandwiches with the slow deliberation of people who had nowhere else to be. Across the aisle, a man in athletic gear was loudly explaining the benefits of intermittent fasting to someone who clearly hadn't asked. Malcolm leaned back. He didn't have the energy for people watching. He just wanted this flight to be over. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement in first class. An older woman with silver hair stepped into view. She wore a navy pantsuit, understated pearls, and reading glasses tucked into the neckline of her blouse. There was something graceful about her, but grounded too. Her gaze swept across the gate area like someone cataloging the scene. Their eyes met. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Just a simple nod. Malcolm nodded back, barely perceptible. He didn't know who she was. Not yet, but she noticed things. He could tell. The speaker above the gate crackled. "We are now boarding Zone 1. First-class passengers and active-duty military may proceed." The silver-haired woman stepped forward, presenting her boarding pass. Cassandra Mills greeted her with a polite nod and stepped aside without a word. The woman walked calmly down the jet bridge, pausing only once to adjust the strap on her leather carry-on. The gate agent resumed her announcements. Zone 2, business class and premium seating. Please have your boarding passes ready. Malcolm stayed where he was, checking the boarding pass on his phone again. Zone 4. Of course, he'd considered calling the airline ahead of time to request pre-boarding, but he didn't want to make a fuss. He didn't want to assume he'd need the exception. Now he regretted it. Micah was starting to wake. His eyelids fluttered and his fingers clenched into small fists again. It would be feeding time soon. Malcolm sighed. A woman 2 rows down was trying to juggle a toddler in a car seat. Her partner, probably husband, was nowhere in sight. Cassandra noticed her and walked over briskly. "Let me help you with that. Ma'am, you can board now. I'll fold the stroller for you." "Thank you so much," the woman said. "Of course," Cassandra replied, smiling brightly. Malcolm stood. "Excuse me," he said softly, stepping toward her. Cassandra turned, her face resetting like a mask. "Yes, I just wanted to check again about pre-boarding. My son is starting to wake up. And, as I said earlier, you'll board with Zone 4. Her voice was even, her expression bored. "I understand," Malcolm replied carefully. "But with infants, I thought there was a policy, sir." Her tone sharpened. "Do you have a medical condition or a documented disability? No? Then you'll board with Zone 4. She turned back toward the gate agent without waiting for a response. Malcolm froze for a second. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't trying to escalate. He just wanted to keep his child calm and safe during what was already a stressful morning. He returned to his seat, jaw tight. Micah let out a soft whimper. Malcolm pulled out the bottle he'd prepared. It was still warm, tucked in a thermal sleeve. He rocked Micah gently as he fed him, watching the rest of the passengers file through. Zone 3. Now boarding all passengers seated in rows 20 through 29. Malcolm looked around. The gate area was thinning. An older couple across from him gave him a sympathetic look. The woman smiled at Micah. The man nodded once at Malcolm. He returned it. There was something universal about holding a child. It softened people, or at least it should have. Zone 4. Now, boarding all remaining passengers, please approach the gate with your boarding passes ready. Finally, he stood, cradling Micah with one arm and his bag with the other. The baby was dozing again, bottle half drunk, cheeks rosy from the feed. He stepped toward the gate, Cassandra glanced at his pass, barely skimming the barcode. "You'll be in seat 27C. "Thank you," Malcolm said. She didn't respond. He walked down the jet bridge, footsteps steady. The air grew quieter as he moved toward the aircraft. The hum of the engines, the soft chatter of boarding passengers, the muffled voices of the flight crew, everything blurred into background. Malcolm boarded and moved toward his seat. Row 27, aisle, seat. The window seat was already taken by a man wearing headphones and tapping rapidly on a laptop. He didn't look up. The middle seat was empty. For now, Malcolm settled in, placing Micah carefully in his lap. He took a deep breath. The cabin was still boarding, voices bouncing off the overhead bins. Somewhere near first class, he heard laughter, female, familiar, Cassandra's voice. The man beside him continued typing. Malcolm leaned back, pulled out Micah's favorite soft elephant toy, and placed it beside the baby's leg. Then he looked up, a few rows ahead, near the curtain that divided the cabin. He caught a glimpse of the woman from earlier, the one with silver hair. She was seated in 1A. She was watching him. Still, not staring, just observing, her expression unreadable. But something about it made Malcolm feel like she was watching more than just him. She was watching the pattern, and maybe, just maybe, she wasn't going to stay silent. The first-class cabin was still quiet, the kind of silence money tends to buy. Wide leather seats, chilled, sparkling water poured before takeoff, and noise-canceling headsets neatly stacked on every armrest. But Irene Caldwell had never been the kind of woman distracted by comfort. She sat upright in 1A, hands folded in her lap, reading glasses dangling from a gold chain. The leather-bound notebook on the tray in front of her was already half filled with observations. Not legal strategy, not casework, just notes, names, impressions. It had been decades since she'd worked as a trial attorney, and nearly 10 years since she stepped down from the federal bench. But her mind never retired. It simply changed rooms. Now, she traveled frequently for panels, lectures, advisory boards. Her current project, a nationwide report on civil rights violations in transportation, taxis, ride shares, bus routes, airport profiling, airline disparities. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. And sometimes, if she was lucky, the data turned into stories. She had boarded Flight 418 early, as first-class passengers always did. It gave her time to observe boarding protocols, to see who was helped, who was ignored, who was spoken to with warmth, and who with suspicion. Patterns. That's what she was always looking for. Patterns. Systems that whispered discrimination rather than shouted it. Today, it hadn't taken long. She saw him almost immediately, a tall, broad-shouldered black man holding an infant with remarkable tenderness. His face was careful. That was the word she'd written in her notes. Not tired, not stressed, careful. There was something practiced in his movements, like he was walking through the world expecting to be watched, judged, blamed. She'd watched him try to speak with the flight attendant at the gate. He had gestured politely toward his baby, clearly requesting assistance. The flight attendant, Cassandra, if she remembered correctly, had shut him down without hesitation. No visible anger, just a quick, hard no. A cold switch flipped. Moments later, the same woman had helped a white mother with a toddler and stroller, smiling as she knelt down to assist. Irene didn't need a court record to know what she had just witnessed. The difference wasn't in policy. It was in posture. It was in tone. It was in who was assumed to be telling the truth, and who had to prove their worthiness. She turned slightly in her seat, just enough to glance down the aisle into the main cabin. The man, Malcolm, had just taken his seat near the back of the plane. She'd seen him glance her way briefly during boarding, his expression calm but guarded. A nod of acknowledgement passed between them. She'd nodded back. Now she watched him settle the child against his chest, tuck a soft toy beside the baby's leg, and begin adjusting the bag beneath the seat. A routine act, but layered. Men like Malcolm didn't often receive the benefit of being seen as nurturing, even less so when they traveled alone with a child. She had once presided over a custody case where the opposing attorney had suggested that a black father couldn't possibly manage a 3-year-old alone. The courtroom had gone still. She'd paused, removed her glasses, and said, "Do you have evidence to support that claim, counselor? Or is your argument resting entirely on your assumptions about race and fatherhood?" The man had stumbled through an apology. She never forgot it. Now, watching Malcolm, she thought of her own grandson, 26, tall, smart, quiet, the kind of young black man who learned early to keep his hands visible when pulled over, who dressed in blazers when flying, just to signal he belonged. He texted her every time he boarded a plane, and every time he landed, just in case. Irene shifted slightly in her seat and took a sip of the sparkling water in front of her. Her hand hovered above her notebook. She wrote Flight 418, passenger black male, solo with infant, denied pre-boarding request, same request granted to white mother moments later, flight attendant name, tag C, Mills. She underlined the name. Behind her, a male voice chuckled lightly. Another first-class passenger, perhaps reading something on his phone. The cabin was still boarding, the rustle of carry-ons and overhead bins like soft waves lapping at the shore. Then Irene heard Cassandra's voice again. Louder now, sharper. "Sir, I already told you you'll board with Zone 4. Irene didn't need to turn her head to know who she was talking to. She waited. A beat. 2. Then she heard the man's voice. Calm, even, patient. Still, the kind of voice trained by a lifetime of de-escalation. "I just wanted to clarify the policy." There was no answer, only the hum of the air vent and the shuffle of shoes. Moments later, Malcolm boarded. She caught his profile as he moved down the aisle. He looked straight ahead. He didn't ask for help with the bag. He didn't make eye contact with the other passengers. She saw the small flush of embarrassment that crept into his neck. She'd seen it before. In young public defenders, in community organizers, in fathers at school board meetings. That was the thing about public indignity. It didn't always come as shouting or slurs. Sometimes it came in the form of being ignored, spoken over, denied, quietly and efficiently, while others were granted ease. Irina closed her notebook and sat back in her seat. She didn't know yet whether this flight would become a story she told. But her instincts told her to stay alert, to keep watching, to be ready, not just because of Malcolm, but because sometimes the right witness in the right moment could mean the difference between silence and change. She reached up and turned off her reading light, adjusted her seat belt, and whispered softly to no one in particular, "I'm watching, just in case someone needs me to be." The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. Micah was still asleep, resting against Malcolm's chest, his breath warm and even, his fingers curled into the edge of his father's collar. Malcolm exhaled slowly, The first 30 minutes of the flight had passed without incident, which, when traveling with an infant, was a minor miracle. He adjusted Micah's blanket and carefully leaned his head back against the seat. The air in the cabin was dry, pressurized, tinged faintly with brewing coffee and recycled breath. Conversations hummed around him, but nothing sharp or disruptive, just the ordinary noise of a full plane at cruising altitude. For a moment, it felt manageable. Malcolm closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Instead, his mind drifted to the last time he and Selena had flown together. It was a trip to Sedona, 2 years ago. A baby moon of sorts. She had insisted on it before her 3rd trimester. They hiked Red Rock Canyons and laughed over lukewarm room service. She'd bought a tiny pair of hiking boots for the baby and tucked them away, saying, "They'll grow into them. They never got used." His jaw tightened. He opened his eyes. The flight attendant's voice filtered through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin beverage service shortly. Please remain seated unless absolutely necessary." Cassandra's voice, professional, pleasant, the kind of tone that made people think she was competent, even kind. But Malcolm knew better. He glanced toward the front of the plane. She was already moving down the aisle, her cart stocked with cans of ginger ale and plastic cups. She smiled at some passengers, offered recommendations to others. When she passed a group of college-aged girls, she laughed at one of their jokes, placing a hand gently on the seat back as she leaned in. Malcolm watched her closely. She hadn't looked at him again since boarding. A few rows ahead, he saw the man with the laptop now asleep, mouth open, headphones askew. Micah stirred. The motion was slight, a shift in breath, a tiny grunt. Malcolm adjusted the baby's head and reached for the diaper bag beneath the seat. He unzipped it halfway and pulled out the bottle he'd warmed earlier that morning. It was no longer warm, maybe lukewarm at best. He glanced around. Cassandra had just begun her service 3 rows ahead. He could wait. Maybe. Micah's lips moved. Then he let out a small whimper. Another. Louder. The rhythm had started. The early signs. Malcolm knew them all. He tried bouncing gently, whispering softly into the baby's hair. It helped. For a moment. Then Micah began to cry. Not a full scream. Not yet. But rising. Malcolm stood slightly and looked toward the aisle. "Excuse me," he called softly as Cassandra approached the next row. She didn't turn. "Excuse me," he repeated, a bit louder. She glanced back, eyes unreadable. "Yes. Could I please have some hot water to warm a bottle for my son? It would only take a moment." She blinked. "I'm in the middle of beverage service. I understand. It's just he's starting to get hungry. I'd appreciate," she sighed audibly. "I'll get to it when I can." Then she turned back to the couple in 18A and B, asking if they preferred Diet Coke or Sprite. Malcolm sat back, carefully placing the bottle in the seat back pocket. Micah's crying had grown louder. A few passengers turned to look. A man across the aisle pulled his baseball cap lower and shifted away. A woman, 1 row up, gave him a tight smile, the kind that said, "I feel for you, but also, please make it stop soon." Malcolm's heart beat faster. He rocked Micah again, murmuring softly, "You're okay, little one. We're going to get you fed. I promise." He glanced toward first class. The curtain separating the cabins had parted slightly. Irene Caldwell sat in her seat, one hand resting on her notebook, the other on her lap. She was watching again. Malcolm met her eyes for a breath, then looked away. 10 more minutes passed. No water, no bottle, just crying. Cassandra had reached the last few rows of her service. She laughed again with a man in 31C, asking about his weekend plans. When he requested club soda with a twist of lime, she returned with it promptly. Malcolm's hands clenched the edge of his tray table. He pressed the call button above his seat. A soft chime rang overhead. Cassandra looked up, saw the light, but she didn't move. Instead, she handed a cup to another passenger and rolled the cart 1 row forward. Micah was now crying full volume. The sound cut through the cabin like a siren. Malcolm reached into the diaper bag for a second pacifier. The first had long since vanished into some corner of the carry-on. He tried to offer it to Micah, but the baby turned his head, wailing louder. A woman across the aisle leaned over. "Would you like some napkins? I think your bottle's leaking." "Thank you," Malcolm said, realizing his hand had tightened too hard on the bottle's soft plastic, pushing milk toward the rim. He took the napkins and breathed through his nose. Cassandra finally returned. "Here." She handed him the bottle. No explanation, no apology. He tested the temperature against the inside of his wrist, barely above room temperature. Micah grabbed it anyway, desperate, gulping fast between sobs. Cassandra remained standing beside the row. "You really should try to control your child better. Other passengers are trying to relax." Her voice carried. Just enough. Malcolm looked up. "Thank you for the bottle." His tone was flat. He wasn't going to give her what she wanted. Cassandra walked away, but not before leaning toward the male attendant, Ethan, and whispering something. Malcolm didn't catch the words, but he saw the look, disgust, dismissal, as if his presence here was somehow inappropriate. As if being a black man traveling alone with a baby was cause for suspicion or contempt. He looked down at Micah. The baby was quiet again, sucking slowly, exhausted. He kissed the top of his son's head, then leaned back and stared at the ceiling of the cabin. He remembered Selena's voice again. "Don't let them turn your restraint into permission." He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but something was shifting. Something was coming. Micah had drifted back to sleep, the half-empty bottle resting in the crook of Malcolm's arm. His small chest rose and fell with a soft rhythm, and one chubby hand clutched the ear of the worn stuffed elephant tucked into his side. His face had calmed, but there was a faint redness beneath his eyes from the crying earlier. Malcolm sat still, careful not to shift too quickly. Any sudden motion might stir Micah and begin the process all over again. He closed his eyes. He tried to let it go, the delay, the look Cassandra had given him, the comment about controlling his child. But his thoughts refused to settle. He replayed the exchange again and again, picking apart her tone, her timing, her indifference, trying to decide if he was overreacting, trying to justify why it still sat so heavily in his chest. Behind the restraint in his face, something inside him was simmering. He remembered his mentor's words back at the hospital. Dr. Lockwood, one of the few black men in senior leadership. "You'll spend your whole life balancing on a tightrope. Malcolm, if you stand up too fast, they call you angry. If you stay seated too long, they call you weak. Just don't ever let them tell your story for you." He'd nodded when Lockwood said that. Back then, it felt like advice for another day. But now, 36,000 feet in the air, with his son sleeping in his arms and the quiet residue of disrespect clinging to his skin, It felt like prophecy. A sharp laugh cut through the cabin. Malcolm looked up. Cassandra was back in the front galley, leaning against the wall, speaking with Ethan. They weren't whispering this time. They weren't trying to hide their conversation. He couldn't hear every word, but he caught one sentence. These people never prepare, always expect special treatment. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He stared at the tray table in front of him, willing himself to stay calm. A woman across the aisle looked up, frowning. Did she hear it too? Ethan glanced toward Malcolm for a moment. Their eyes met. His expression faltered. Then he looked away. Cassandra kept talking, as if nothing had happened. Malcolm felt his chest tighten. He glanced again toward the front of the plane. The curtain was open just enough for him to see Irene Caldwell still seated in 1A. Her notebook was open again. Her pen was moving. She had heard. She was documenting. But she didn't speak. Not yet. Micah stirred again. A soft whimper escaped his lips, and Malcolm instinctively reached for the bottle. It was nearly empty. He glanced at the bag beneath the seat. He had another one prepared, but it was cold now, far too cold for Micah to drink without protest. He hesitated, then pressed the call button again. A chime rang above him. A few heads turned, but no one said anything. No one came. 3 minutes passed, then 4. He pressed it again. Finally, Cassandra appeared. She didn't smile. She didn't speak right away. She just looked down at him. "What do you need now?" Her tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind. Malcolm held up the second bottle. "Could you please warm this one?" Her eyes flicked toward the bottle, then to Micah, then back to him. "We're preparing for turbulence. You should have asked earlier." He kept his tone measured. "There's no turbulence yet. It'll take 30 seconds. Please." She took the bottle wordlessly and walked away. Micah began to fuss again. This time, Malcolm didn't bounce him. He just held him close and waited. 10 minutes passed. No bottle. 15. Still nothing. Micah's whimpers turned into soft cries. Malcolm tried everything. The pacifier, the elephant, the rhythmic tapping of fingers on his back. Nothing helped. People were looking again. The woman across the aisle shook her head slightly. This time, not at the baby, at something else, at the situation. Finally, Cassandra returned. She handed the bottle to Malcolm without a word. It was barely warm. He tested it on his wrist. Not enough, but he had no choice. Micah took it with a small cry and began to drink. His hands trembled. Malcolm didn't realize it until that moment. Cassandra remained standing. "You really ought to bring your own equipment for this. You can't expect crew members to drop everything." She said it quietly, but loud enough. Malcolm met her gaze. "I didn't ask you to drop everything. I asked you to do your job." Her expression hardened. "If you have a complaint, feel free to take it up with customer service after landing." Then she turned and walked away again. As she passed Ethan, she muttered something. Malcolm couldn't hear it, but Ethan turned to glance back at him, clearly uncomfortable. Micah finished the bottle and let out a soft hiccup. He was calming again, but Malcolm wasn't. He'd held it in long enough. He pressed the call button again. This time, Irene stood up from her seat. She didn't wait for the crew. She walked the length of the aisle, calm and deliberate, until she reached Malcolm's row. "Excuse me," she said to the woman sitting next to him. "May I?" The woman nodded and stood, stepping aside. Irene sat next to Malcolm, her eyes kind but steady. She looked at Micah first, then at the empty bottle, then at Malcolm. "Are you all right?" He took a breath before answering. No, he wasn't. He had done everything right. He had followed every rule. He had asked with respect. He had waited patiently, and he had been met with contempt. He looked at Irene. "They wouldn't treat someone else this way." "No," she said softly, "they wouldn't." "Who are you?" Her smile was small. "I'm someone who's seen enough to know when silence helps no one." She looked toward the galley. "They've already crossed the line. The question is, what do you want to do?" Malcolm looked down at his son. Micah's eyes were half closed, his breathing steady. Then he looked back at Irene. "I want accountability. You may get resistance," she warned, "and headlines, and pushback. I'm not afraid of resistance. Good, because the next part won't be quiet." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane leveled into cruise. A few window shades were drawn. Screens flickered with muted movies. Passengers settled into that mid-flight lull where time seemed to pause, caught between takeoff and destination. Malcolm stayed seated. Micah nestled back in the crook of his arm. The baby's cries had faded to a light, breathy hum, his mouth now slack from sleep. The warm bottle lay empty in the seat-back pocket, forgotten. Irene sat quietly beside them, her hands resting on her lap. She hadn't said much after Malcolm's final words in the last exchange. She didn't need to. Her presence alone had steadied him. Malcolm shifted just enough to stretch his back. He exhaled quietly. For a moment, the tension that had built over the last few hours started to ease. Then, Cassandra reappeared. She moved with purpose. Her steps clipped but fluid as she approached with the beverage cart. Her eyes passed over Malcolm like he wasn't there. She reached across the aisle, handing a passenger a cup of tomato juice, then leaned forward to serve another with apple cider. The cart rattled slightly as she adjusted the hot water container perched at the top. She didn't glance at Malcolm, but Irene noticed it. The jug of near-boiling water wasn't secured properly. It tilted slightly with every motion of the cart, the silver lid vibrating, its hinge loose. Cassandra reached to pour a cup for the man beside Malcolm, and in doing so, jerked the cart just a few inches too far. The container tipped, a metallic clatter, a splash, a scream. The water cascaded down like a flash flood. Scalding, instant, it hit Malcolm's arm, rolled across his sleeve and knee, and spilled across Micah's blanket. The baby jerked violently awake, then let out a scream unlike anything Malcolm had ever heard. Shrill, guttural, piercing. Malcolm shot up from his seat, eyes wild, ripping the blanket away, pulling Micah close to inspect him. His tiny legs kicked, flailing, his hands clenched into fists of shock, the side of his thigh red, angry red, blistering already. Oh God, oh God. The scream didn't stop. Irene stood up. "Get a cold compress. Now." Her voice was sharp, immediate. Ethan appeared behind Cassandra. Frozen for half a second. Now Irene barked again. He turned and ran to the galley. Malcolm held Micah close, his hands trembling. "He's burned. He's burned. He's burned." He was trying to stay calm. He was trying not to break. But Micah's scream, it was splitting him open. Passengers nearby had risen from their seats. A few were filming. Others gasped. A woman started crying. Cassandra stood still, her hand still holding the empty container. Her lips parted, but no words came. I didn't. You didn't secure the container." Irene snapped. "You dropped near boiling water on an infant." "It was an accident," Cassandra whispered, her voice cracking. "That doesn't make it less dangerous." Ethan returned with cold compresses and gauze. Malcolm took them, placing one carefully over Micah's thigh, trying to block out the baby's cries as he soothed him. "You're okay, baby. Daddy's got you. You're okay." But he wasn't okay. None of them were. Malcolm's sleeve was soaked, his forearm red from the spill, but he didn't even register it. Everything in him was locked on Micah. The baby began to gasp between cries, sharp inhalations, a hiccup and sob. Malcolm kissed his forehead over and over, eyes wet now, his body trembling. Passengers had begun to whisper. "Is that his baby? What happened? Why was she even carrying that jug? Someone needs to do something." A voice rose from the back of the cabin. He asked for help earlier. She ignored him. Twice, another joined in. He was so calm, and she kept brushing him off. Ethan turned toward Malcolm. "I'm so sorry, sir. I should have been paying attention." "I didn't." Malcolm didn't look at him. His eyes were on Cassandra. She still hadn't moved. Her face had gone pale. He could see it now. She thought he would explode. She expected the outburst, the yelling. But he didn't give it to her. He held his child tighter and said, voice low and steady, "You should have listened the first time." Then he turned to Irene. "I need paramedics waiting when we land. He needs to be seen immediately. I'll make the call," she said, "and I'm filing a formal report." Cassandra finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt him. That's not the point," Irene said. "The point is, you had every opportunity to treat them with care. You chose not to." She looked around the cabin. Did anyone else see what happened? Hands rose, voices agreed. Some passengers began writing down what they'd witnessed, names, seat numbers. "You're not invisible anymore," Irene said softly. Not to Malcolm, but to Cassandra. That moment was when it shifted, from incident to evidence, from silence to witness, from harm to accountability. Malcolm sat back down slowly, Micah still sobbing in his arms. He adjusted the compress gently, then closed his eyes. The pain was still there. So was the heat. But he wasn't alone, not anymore. He felt the weight of strangers' eyes not with suspicion, but solidarity. He felt the quiet power of a woman who'd stood up not with volume, but with truth. And he felt something else, something burning hotter than the water, conviction, because they would land soon. And when they did, this wouldn't end. It would only begin. The captain's voice broke through the cabin with a controlled calm that barely masked the tension beneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of a medical situation on board. We'll be making an expedited descent into Denver. Medical personnel will be standing by upon arrival. We ask that you remain seated for the remainder of the flight and keep the aisles clear. Thank you for your cooperation." There was a pause. Then a wave of murmurs swept through the cabin. Malcolm didn't hear most of it. He sat with Micah wrapped tightly against his chest. The cold compress now slightly warmed from the heat of their bodies. His own shirt was damp from sweat and the earlier spill, clinging to his back and arms. Micah had stopped screaming, but he wasn't asleep either. His breathing was shallow, and every few minutes he let out a soft cry, small but sharp. Malcolm whispered into his ear over and over again, "You're safe. Daddy's here. I got you." He wasn't saying it just for Micah. He was saying it to steady his own hands, which were still trembling, to hold back the roar of panic sitting just beneath his sternum, to keep himself from unraveling in front of these strangers. Across the aisle, passengers had fallen quiet. Some leaned over to offer sympathetic glances. Others clutched their phones more tightly, silently waiting to see if someone else would be the first to post what had just happened. In 1A, Irene Caldwell was on her phone, fingers moving fast. She wasn't scrolling. She was documenting text messages, voice memos, legal observations jotted into her digital notepad with the care of someone who understood what evidence meant in the court of public opinion. Every detail matters. She had once said to a junior attorney during a civil rights deposition, "Tone, timing, temperature, even silence. It all adds up." She glanced back toward Malcolm's row now, her face composed, but her jaw set. Ethan appeared beside Malcolm, crouching slightly to meet his eye. "Sir, I just want to say I'm so sorry. What happened, there's no excuse for it. If you need a statement from me, I'll give one." "I saw it all." Malcolm nodded. He didn't speak. He couldn't trust his voice yet. Ethan looked down at Micah, his expression softening. "I've got a young niece. If anything like this happened to her, I can't imagine." He stood and turned toward Cassandra, who stood near the galley, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her gaze was fixed on some point far away, as if refusing to look at what she'd done would somehow erase it. But the passengers were watching her. No more polite glances, no more blank stares. Now it was scrutiny. Now it was memory. One row up, a teenage girl held her phone slightly aloft, still recording. The red light blinked slowly. Cassandra finally spoke. "Do we really need to divert the whole flight?" Ethan didn't answer. But the silence that followed was thick. A woman in 19B leaned out of her seat. "Are you serious right now?" Cassandra turned sharply. "It was an accident. That baby's in pain," the woman replied. "You spilled boiling water on him. You ignored his father multiple times. Everyone here saw it. It was policy, no. It wasn't." This time the voice came from further up, a man in 15C, older, stern. "We all saw how you treated him, like he was an inconvenience." Another voice joined. "She helped me with my stroller right away. Didn't ask a thing." And another. "He was calm the whole flight. And you acted like he didn't belong here." Cassandra looked around the cabin and saw something she wasn't used to. Accountability. Passengers weren't just whispering now. They were speaking, naming what they'd seen. She took a step back into the galley and disappeared behind the curtain. Malcolm exhaled. Irene returned to her seat but stopped next to him first. "Paramedics will meet us at the gate. I've notified the airline's legal department and a friend at the ACLU." He blinked. "You didn't have to do all that." She looked him in the eye. "Yes, I did, because people like you shouldn't have to fight alone. Not anymore." The plane began to descend. Turbulence rocked slightly, and the captain's voice returned, instructing cabin crew to prepare for landing. The fastened seatbelt light flicked on again. Micah whimpered softly, shifting in Malcolm's arms. "Almost there, baby. Almost." The runway came into view below. Denver's cityscape shimmered in the morning haze. Distant mountains standing quiet in the background like watchful sentinels. The wheels touched down. A collective breath moved through the plane. Passengers sat upright. Phones came out. Malcolm looked up just as Cassandra returned to her jump seat, her eyes down, her hands clenched. When the plane rolled to a stop, the intercom crackled. Please remain seated until paramedics have assisted with the medical situation at row 27. Thank you for your cooperation. The cabin stayed still. Malcolm heard the sirens before he saw the personnel. Then the doors opened and 2 EMTs boarded with equipment bags and calm, focused expressions. Which one, row 27, said the pilot. Malcolm stood carefully as they approached, still cradling Micah close. He's got a burn, inner thigh, hot water. One EMT nodded. Let's take a look. Passengers leaned back, giving space. One woman touched Malcolm's arm lightly as he passed. We're with you, she said. Another added, get a lawyer, and a third simply said, thank you for staying calm. Malcolm didn't respond, but he nodded once. That was all he could manage. The EMT examined Micah's leg, applied coolant gel, and gently wrapped the area. We'll need to get him to a hospital for evaluation. But you did the right thing, keeping the area cool. You might have saved him from a deeper burn. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 20 minutes. Irene stepped off the plane behind him. She looked back once, locking eyes with Cassandra, who, for the first time, looked shaken, not by guilt, by consequence. Outside on the tarmac, a stretch of air was roped off for emergency access. A few reporters had already arrived. One of the EMTs leaned over and said quietly, "You're about to be on a lot of screens." Malcolm didn't flinch. He looked down at Micah's sleepy eyes and kissed his forehead. If that's what it takes. The terminal was a blur of sound and movement. People walked briskly past the gate, dragging carry-ons, checking phones, hugging loved ones, scanning signs for baggage claim. Life continued, indifferent. But in the center of it all, just past the boarding door of Flight 418 stood a small circle that felt suspended in time. Malcolm held Micah close, the baby wrapped tightly in a soft, hospital-issued blanket the EMTs had given him in the ambulance. His thigh was now coated with antibiotic cream, bandaged, and elevated slightly to avoid pressure. He was sleeping again, small whimpers escaping every few minutes like memories still clinging to him. Malcolm barely noticed the voices around him anymore. "Sir, do you need a ride to the hospital? Can I call someone for you? Would you like to file a report now or wait for legal counsel?" Flashes from cameras began to spark just beyond the terminal ropes. Not paparazzi yet, but journalists. Local, regional. Someone had leaked what happened. Or maybe it had leaked itself. Videos, photos, passenger testimony. It didn't take long. Malcolm stood tall but quiet, one hand on Micah's back, the other gripping the strap of his bag. He wore the same shirt soaked with spilled water, stained dark across the sleeve and shoulder. He hadn't changed. He wanted people to see it, the physical residue of carelessness. Irene Caldwell stepped up beside him. Her posture was composed, her suit jacket crisp, but her eyes never left Malcolm's. The airline's director of customer response will be here in 5 minutes. They're sending someone from legal, too. PR is already circling. I'm not interested in an apology drafted by marketing, Malcolm said. You shouldn't be. Then what do? You ask for more than words. A journalist called out from behind the press rope. Dr. Reed, can you comment on what happened during your flight? He didn't answer. Another reporter followed up. Were you denied assistance during the flight because of your race? Still, silence. He wasn't ready to speak to the crowd. Not yet. Not when his son still whimpered in his arms. A few feet away, Cassandra Mills stood stiffly between two airline managers. She looked pale. She clutched a folder to her chest like a shield. Her name was trending online already. Someone had posted a screenshot of her staff ID badge from a previous flight. There were calls for her termination, for a federal investigation. Ethan stood nearby, quiet, looking down. One of the EMTs came over and touched Malcolm's arm gently. "We're ready to transport when you are, but no rush. I understand." Malcolm looked at Micah, the bandages, the warmth of his skin, the tiny weight of his body, the way he trusted his father without question. He looked up and saw cameras still trained on him. Then he made a decision. "Give me 1 second." He stepped away from the EMTs and toward the podium just beside Gate 17. Irene followed, standing at his side but a step behind. Malcolm turned to face the crowd of reporters, passengers, and employees now gathered like an impromptu tribunal. "I'm not here to go viral," he said calmly. "I'm here because I asked for basic humanity, and was denied it." His voice didn't waver. "I'm a pediatric surgeon. I've spent most of my career helping children heal from the worst kinds of injuries. But today, I had to watch my own child scream in pain because someone decided my presence was a problem, not a priority." He shifted Micah gently in his arms. "This could have been avoided. I asked for help, twice. I was told to wait. I was told it wasn't time, that I didn't meet the criteria, and now my son is bandaged, burned, and frightened. Cameras clicked, and still I'm calm, because I know what would happen if I weren't. I know what it means to raise my voice as a black man in public. I know what it costs to demand dignity, but my restraint should never have to be the reason my child is protected." His voice rose slightly now, not angry but clear. We all deserve better than that. Passengers from the flight stood behind him now, some nodding. A few held their phones down, no longer filming, just listening. Today was never about a bottle or a blanket. It was about how systems quietly decide who gets care and who gets questioned, and that needs to change. He stepped back. Silence followed, heavy and real. Then someone clapped. 1, then 2, then a ripple, not thunderous applause, but acknowledgement, respect. Irene leaned in. "You just changed the story." Malcolm didn't smile. He turned to the EMTs and followed them toward the waiting van. As they left, he heard one of the journalists say into their mic, "Dr. Malcolm Reed, pediatric surgeon, spoke today not just as a father, but as a man asking for equity in the most human of moments when a child needed care and was denied." The doors slid open. Outside, the sun was rising higher, and Malcolm knew, for the first time that day, they were done flying, but they were just beginning to rise. The hospital room was quiet. Micah lay in a small crib next to the window, a soft blue light cast across his cheeks from the monitor screen. His leg was freshly bandaged. The doctors had confirmed it was a second-degree burn. Not deep enough to need surgery, but deep enough to blister, deep enough to hurt. He'd been given a small dose of baby-safe pain relievers and finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. Every now and then, his body twitched, a memory flaring in his tiny muscles. Malcolm sat beside the crib with one hand resting gently over his son's. His other hand clutched a bottle of water he hadn't opened. It had gone warm, forgotten. He hadn't slept. His phone buzzed again, another text, another voicemail, another request from someone he didn't know, journalists, advocacy groups, civil rights lawyers, medical colleagues, even celebrities. They all wanted a quote, a statement, a comment on the viral moment. But Malcolm hadn't given any interviews. Not yet. He didn't know what to say. He was a surgeon, not a spokesperson. A father, not a symbol. He wasn't trying to build a movement. He was trying to keep his child safe. But something had shifted. The video was everywhere now. People had watched him speak at the gate, holding his son like a shield. They had replayed the footage from passengers who had recorded Cassandra's earlier refusals, her body language, her tone. There were slow-motion breakdowns of the moment the boiling water spilled. The internet had done what the internet does. It had taken pain and turned it into momentum, but Malcolm hadn't moved yet. There was a knock at the door. He looked up, startled. It was Irene. She stepped inside quietly, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. I brought decaf. You looked like you needed a warm hand more than a caffeine rush. He took one of the cups and held it, not drinking, just grateful for the gesture. How's he resting? Finally. She sat across from him. You've been quiet, she said. I don't know what to do next. You don't have to do anything. Malcolm, not unless you want to. He stared at the monitor, at the rhythmic beeping of his son's heart. People are watching, waiting for a statement, a campaign, something. They're waiting because you told the truth, Irene said. You stood still and honest in a moment where others would have exploded or shut down. And now the world saw a version of dignity they didn't expect. But what if I say the wrong thing? Then you try again. This isn't surgery. Malcolm, there's no perfect incision here. He looked down at the cup in his hand. There's a news anchor, local, wants a one-on-one. I haven't said yes. What's holding you back? Everything, he said. He stood and walked toward the crib, gently brushing Micah's hair. I keep thinking about what happens after the interview. What if people turn on us? What if it becomes about politics or spin? What if it becomes something I can't control? Irene stood and walked to his side. Then you do what you've always done. You lead with your values. You speak like a father, not a politician, and you keep telling the truth. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. Okay. 3 days later, the interview was set. It took place in a quiet studio with soft lights and no live audience. The anchor, a composed black woman named Avery Lane, had interviewed politicians, athletes, and community activists, but rarely doctors. And never a pediatric surgeon holding a 6-month-old in his lap. They kept it simple. 1 camera, 1 chair, Micah, bundled safely against his father's chest, sucking quietly on a pacifier. Avery began gently, Dr. Reed, thank you for being here. I know this must be a difficult time for you and your family. Malcolm nodded. It is. But I also know silence doesn't protect anyone. Avery leaned in slightly. You've said before you weren't trying to become a spokesperson. What changed? My son screamed in my arms for 5 straight minutes, and no one came. He paused, and then I realized it wasn't the first time something like that had happened to someone who looked like me. It just happened to be the first time someone recorded it. That can't be the line between truth and justice. Avery let the moment breathe. What would you say to people who think this was just a mistake, that the flight attendant didn't mean harm? I'd say intent doesn't cancel impact. And when harm comes after repeated disregard, it's not just a mistake. It's a symptom of something bigger. You're referring to systemic bias. Yes, and fatigue, and assumption, and the quiet, everyday choices people make about who gets care first and who doesn't get it at all. Avery's voice softened. "And how is your son now? Healing. He won't remember the pain, but I will." There was a long pause. Then Avery asked the question that hadn't been asked publicly yet. "What do you want, Malcolm?" He looked directly into the lens. "I want an industry that doesn't require viral footage to do the right thing. I want better training, better hiring, better culture. I want fathers like me to stop being treated like intruders in places we have every right to be. And I want my son to grow up knowing that when something hurts, someone will help not walk away." The screen faded to black. The interview aired that night. Within hours, the airline issued a full statement and announced a temporary suspension of the staff involved. By morning, they committed to an independent audit of their crew training program. But Malcolm didn't celebrate. He sat in the dark of his living room, Micah asleep in a crib beside the couch, the TV off. He didn't need applause. He needed change, and it was only just beginning. 3 weeks after the flight, the letter arrived. It wasn't sent by email or delivered by courier. It came through the regular mail, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting was careful, slightly slanted, as if each letter had been pressed into the page with intention. Malcolm found it on a Thursday morning, tucked between a hospital bill and a flyer for roof repair. He opened it at the kitchen counter, one hand on the kettle, the other still sore from morning rounds. Inside were 2 pages, handwritten, no greeting, just a first line that read, "I'm not sure if I deserve to write this, but I need to try." He stood very still, then slowly began to read. "I wasn't trained to be cruel. That's not what they teach us. They talk about efficiency, protocol, timing, passenger loads, chain of command. They talk about policies and keeping things on schedule, but they don't talk about bias. Not really. Not in the ways that count. They don't talk about how easy it becomes to see certain passengers as friction and others as family." I was tired that morning, but that's no excuse. I'd already helped 3 families pre-board, smiled at a woman who asked for an extra blanket, told a nervous first-time flyer she'd be fine, but when you asked for help, I hesitated. I evaluated, without even realizing I was doing it, and I said no. It wasn't about the rules, it was about me. You were composed, clear, respectful, but something in me pushed back anyway. It wasn't until later, after the spill, after the scream, after your child's cry, that I realized how many decisions I'd made without saying a word. "I'm sorry." Malcolm blinked. He sat down slowly at the table, kettle forgotten. The next page continued. "I know the internet knows my name now, that people are calling for me to be fired, that others say I'm just a scapegoat for a system that's always been broken. I don't know what's fair anymore. All I know is what I did and what I didn't do. I didn't help you. I didn't listen. I didn't believe you were worthy of the same care I would have given someone else. Without question. That's something I have to live with. After the incident, they put me on administrative leave. I met with HR, then legal, then union reps, but the conversation I keep replaying isn't with any of them, it's with myself. I keep hearing your voice, even though you never shouted, even though you never raised it. I hear what it sounds like when dignity refuses to be erased. I'm writing this not to ask for forgiveness that's not mine to request, but to tell you that I see it now. What I did, and what it means. Your son deserved better. So did you, and I promise, if I ever wear that uniform again, I will be different. Sincerely, Cassandra Mills. Malcolm sat at the table for a long time, the letter flat on the wood between his fingers. Outside, the world continued. A delivery truck rolled past the house. A neighbor's dog barked at a squirrel. The wind moved gently through the tree outside the kitchen window. But inside, something had shifted. He didn't know what to feel at first. The letter didn't erase what happened. It didn't undo the injury. It didn't restore the sleep he'd lost, the worry he carried, the flash of panic every time Micah cried with that same shrill pitch. But it did something. It cracked the armor. Not his, hers. And that mattered. He read the letter again, slower this time. Cassandra hadn't asked to be excused. She hadn't tried to justify. She didn't lean on excuses. She named it. That meant more than he expected. Later that evening, Irene stopped by. She brought soup and news. The airline's board is requesting a formal independent review of training practices. And passenger testimony from your flight is being added to a National Transportation Oversight Report. The Department of Transportation has quietly opened a file. Malcolm nodded. Progress. Small, but real. She noticed the letter on the table. What's that? He handed it to her. She read silently. When she finished, she placed it down without comment, then looked at him. Are you going to respond? I don't think she expects me to. That wasn't the question. Malcolm looked over at Micah, who was lying on a playmat in the corner of the room, chewing gently on a soft rubber giraffe. I'm not sure yet, he said. It's okay not to know. Irene replied. But maybe what matters most isn't what you say to her. It's what you choose to say next to the world. He folded the letter, gently, maybe both. The next day, Malcolm sat at his desk and began to write. Not a letter, but a speech. He'd been invited to speak at a national symposium on equity in public service industries. He hadn't said yes until now. He didn't write with fire. He wrote with steadiness, with the hand of a father, of a man who had seen what it meant to be denied care and what it took to claim it back. He wrote the story, not for pity, but for truth. And then, at the bottom of the page, he added a line that hadn't been part of any draft before. Forgiveness doesn't start with forgetting. It starts with someone finally telling the truth, even if it's late. The auditorium was quiet in a way only a room full of professionals could be. Restless minds, still bodies, all waiting for someone to speak first. Rows of chairs curved inward toward a modest stage. A soft golden light filled the space, not too bright, not too dim, polished wood underfoot, a backdrop of navy and gray. The words National Symposium on Equity in Service Industries hung above the stage in clean white lettering. The audience included airline executives, flight crew unions, transportation policy advisors, civil rights advocates, and medical professionals. Some wore suits, others polos and flats. A few clutched notebooks, most held phones. Every seat was taken. Backstage. Malcolm stood in silence. He wasn't nervous in the way most people would be before a speech. He'd been in operating rooms with far higher stakes. But this was different. This wasn't about saving one life. It was about shifting how people saw hundreds, thousands of lives that passed unseen every day. He adjusted the collar of his button-down, looked once at the photo in his hand, a picture of Micah. taken 2 days ago in the park, smiling with a tiny bandage still on his thigh. He tucked it into his jacket pocket, then stepped onto the stage. He didn't walk fast. He didn't smile wide. He simply arrived. The room hushed. He stood behind the podium, adjusted the mic, then spoke. I want to tell you about a flight, just one flight. Out of the hundreds that take off every day, out of the millions of passengers who move through terminals, aisles, gates, it wasn't a long flight. It wasn't international or historic. It didn't break any speed records, but it changed everything for me. He paused. I'm a pediatric surgeon. I've trained to stay calm when things go wrong, to assess, to act, to help. But that day, I wasn't a doctor. I was just a dad, carrying a baby who couldn't speak for himself and asking, quietly, for help. He looked up at the audience, and help didn't come. He told them the story, not with fire, with precision, not with fury, with depth. He didn't dramatize the moment the boiling water spilled. He didn't linger on Cassandra's face. He didn't replay the internet fallout. He just told the truth, clearly, completely, and with the steady tone of someone who had carried a child through pain and still chosen to walk forward. The problem, he said, isn't just policies. It's not just training. It's not even just who gets hired. The problem is how we see each other. The problem is who we pause for and who we ignore. He let the silence settle again. I was calm that day, not because I wasn't angry, but because I couldn't afford not to be. Because there is no room for rage when your child is crying and the world is watching to see if you'll prove their worst assumption right. A few people shifted in their seats, others nodded. He continued, I'm not here to take down an airline or to blame one person. I'm here because the system that allowed it wasn't built in a day, and it won't be changed by silence. And because one day, my son will grow up and board a flight by himself, and I want to know that when he asks for help, someone will come. Someone will care. He stepped away from the podium. The room stood with him, not a polite standing ovation, a charged, honest one. He walked off stage and into the quiet that followed. Backstage, Irene was waiting. She didn't say much, just pressed a hand to his shoulder. You were exactly who you needed to be, she whispered. Later that afternoon, he returned home. Micah was on the living room rug, propped up on his elbows, babbling at a stuffed elephant. The scar on his thigh was healing well, still pink, still tender, but no longer raw. Malcolm scooped him up, kissed his cheek, and sat down on the couch. The TV was off. The world outside was loud, as always. But here, in this moment, it was just the two of them. The house phone rang. He let it go to voicemail. He didn't need headlines right now. He didn't need applause. He needed the weight of his son against his chest. The feel of Micah's small fingers curled around the drawstring of his hoodie. The quiet miracle of an ordinary afternoon. Later that week, he received a call from a nonprofit asking him to help lead a task force on bias in service professions. He said yes. He didn't do it to be the face of a cause. He did it because he knew what it was like to be unseen. Because someone had to make sure the next Malcolm or the next Micah didn't have to go viral to be believed. That spring, airports across the country quietly updated their staff training protocols. Some airlines began recruiting more intentionally. One airline, the one he'd flown with, launched a new initiative called First Response Listening as Action. They didn't name him in the press release. He didn't ask them to. The gate where it happened, it reopened. Flights resumed, people boarded, babies cried, life went on. But every now and then, a flight attendant walking down the aisle would see a father traveling alone with a baby and stop to ask, before he could say a word, need anything, and that was enough. Malcolm's story is more than just a painful memory of a burned infant or an airline's failure. It's a powerful reminder that discrimination doesn't always shout it, often hides in the quiet refusals, the dismissive glances, the small but relentless ways dignity is denied. Yet, from that dark moment rose a light, the courage to speak up, the resilience to demand change, and the hope that future generations will travel through the skies with respect and care. This story invites us to reflect on the power of bearing witness and the responsibility we all share to confront injustice, no matter how uncomfortable. It challenges us to recognize the humanity in every passenger, every caregiver, and every family. If this story moved you, if you believe in fighting discrimination and honoring dignity, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire change. Together, we can lift voices, expose truth, and create a world where justice is not just a hope, but a reality. Stay with us for our next video because every story matters and every voice counts.